Commissioner Joya.
Here.
Commissioner McGrath.
Here.
Commissioner Peskin. Commissioner Pine.
Here.
Commissioner Ranchad.
Here.
Commissioner Randolph.
Here.
Commissioner Sears.
Here.
Commissioner Tekel. Commissioner Wagenknecht. Commissioner Swissler.
Here.
Commissioner Chappelle.
Here.
Commissioner Gilmore. Commissioner Scharf.
Here.
Commissioner Vasquez, sorry.
Here. Sorry.
Okay, and Commissioner Galakatos.
Here.
We have 18 present.
We have a quorum and we can conduct business. Thank you.
Hey,
Ar-
this is Sharon.
Oh.
I'm here too.
Yes. Commissioner Ziegler.
Welcome back, Commissioner Ziegler. Our next order of business is public comment. I believe I have 4 cards. These are on matters that are not on our agenda. So the first speaker is Bob Wilson.
Thank you. I'm a resident of Redwood City.
Mike, please.
Got it? I'm a resident of Redwood City. I attended the January 18th meeting here, and I was a bit alarmed by Mr. Goldsman's comments regarding the intended use of fines that ought to go to the Bay Fill and Cleanup Fund, but instead are going to be used to hire 2 more staff enforcement lawyers. This practice is in clear violation of the intent of the legislature. See Code Section 66647. The code's clear. Fines collected related to enforcement are to be used to clean up and enhance the bay, not expand staff. I was disappointed that no member of the commission asked any questions regarding this use of funds. I was surprised that this action could be taken unilaterally without a vote. There are already openings posted for these lawyers, and your urgent action is needed. Fines collected by the BCDC in the last 5 years total approximately $1.2 million. Why have they not already been used to improve the bay? Abatement is not about hiring lawyers to do enforcement. It does mean filling, it doesn't mean filling the staff with more attorneys. There's a more urgent need at the BCDC than hiring staff. It's clear to me the staff priorities need to be changed. Based on my knowledge of staff activities, a better use of existing resources would be to redeploying them, first to write better permits, and second, to make room within the current budget to retain and train qualified engineers and inspectors. If you really need more lawyers to work on enforcement, this is a sign of a broken process. Take a look at the 190 backlogged enforcement cases. There's a problem here. It's not solved by lawyers. Meeting minutes from the enforcement workshop held in October of 2016 show the enforcement staff agrees the permitting process is broken. Commissioners, please assist the permit process be fixed. Don't shortchange our bay. Once it's fixed, and if you still have issues with funding, please take that up with the legislature. Reverse this misguided decision of the director to use these funds to hire staff. It's bad process, it's bad, it violates the intent of the law, and it's wrong. By the way, using fines for enforcement staff is not a new practice. In fact, Mr. Goldsman and Mr. McCrae are both on record from that same October meeting in 2016 that use of funds for fines for staffing is inappropriate. They had already stopped this bad practice of previous administrations. What changed and why? Budgets are here for a reason. Circumventing these boundaries is wrong. And while the finance staff of the state may be agreeing now with Mr. Goldsman, they did not make the law and they can't change it. Be aware that this intended practice has been brought to the attention of the state auditor. Commissioners, please get out in front of this issue, stop it, and remind Mr. Goldsman that he should not be using these funds that are intended for restoration of our bay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since the subject matter of the comment has not been posted, we are not going to respond at this meeting. Mr. Rob Cran.
Good afternoon. My name is Rob Crennan. I'm a Palo Alto resident, and my comment is whether or not impartial deliberation is possible. When you consider a typical enforcement order, there are various ways to handle it, including recusing yourselves due to lack of information to deliberate impartially. And the enforcement orders prepared by staff are anything but impartial. A process that begins in a spirit of cooperative compliance will eventually morph into a CDO if the front end of that process breaks down. CDOs by necessity are one-sided and accusatory. They indicate the permit holder's statements of defense, followed by BCDC's arguments to support the violations. The enforcement process seems to me, as a layman, that the entire matter is treated as if someone broke the law. But Mr. Goldspan has stated permits are a kind of contract. It's law versus equity. The issue isn't whether the permit holder broke the law, but whether the permit holder did something lawful but failed to deliver on a promise that resulted in an injury. The remedy is not punishment, but to restore equity such that the injured party is compensated as if injury never happened. And in my opinion, if there's no injury, the violation is immaterial. To make that sort of evaluation, you need much more information than I believe you are typically provided or have the resources to pursue. At least, you would need evidence of injury that I failed to see when looking over your records of your many CDOs. I think your enforcement process is outdated. There's an epidemic of violations all around the Bay. The context of force is not working. And until there's some independent oversight to fix it, we'll continue to lose time and financial resources that can never be replaced. I hope this misfortune is not irrevocably woven into BCDC's fabric. Thank you for your time and listening.
Thank you. The next speaker is Kevin Parker.
Good afternoon. I am here to address the direction of this agency and your challenges as commissioners. Boaters are not your enemies. Remember, it was 800 private boaters, mostly recreational boaters, who put their lives on the line 70 years ago to rescue 300,000 Allied servicemen from the beaches of Normandy, the beaches of Dunkirk. Duck clubs are not your enemies. Duck clubs have every incentive to restore the bay to its pristine condition and preserve the wetlands for migrating wildfowl. Restaurants are not your enemies. Restaurants provide people access to the bay that wouldn't normally have access. There's nothing more pleasant than a family evening spent having a lovely meal with a beautiful view of our wonderful San Francisco Bay. Yet, amazingly, BCDC has conducted a steady campaign against small businesses that serve boaters, sporting clubs, and restaurant diners. In the last 2 years, the staff has attempted to impose fines of almost $2 million against just 3 businesses. 3 businesses that create jobs, 3 businesses that generate taxes, 3 businesses that are supported by voters. In 50 years, BCDC has evolved from stopping illegal filling in the bay to harassing small businesses. That's not an evolution that anybody expected. With punitive fines that are both excessive and lacking in factual accuracy. There seems to be a double standard at play here. One permittee gets fined while another one next door with the same situation seems to escape those same penalties. Are some targets just more juicy? Is there an assumption that because they have the ability to pay, they will? Or do you make a judgment that some shouldn't or can't fight back? What about the public agencies on the staff's list of offenders? Where are the big fines and enforcement actions against those cities and counties and state agencies in violation? They seem to be largely absent from your agendas. Several of you represent those agencies. Are you comfortable voting for financial penalties against those small businesses? And if you're asked to vote for penalties against a neighboring city, how would you feel if your own agency were on the violation list? Would someone consider this the very definition of a circular firing squad? The point is that while staff is dysfunctional, the Commission itself is facing a crisis of its own. It is a crisis of impartiality and conflicting interests. I'm asking you to take a look at your duties and responsibilities. I'm asking you to raise questions that you don't seem to be asking. I'm asking you to understand that unlike most of the other commissions that you sit on, This one has regulatory authority to impose deep financial pain and hardship on small businesses. I hope that you exercise your independence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Peter Lieb.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. My point has been covered, so I'm going to relinquish my time.
Thank you, sir. That concludes our public speakers. Our next item of business is approval of the minutes of February 1st, 2018. We have received draft minutes of the meeting held on February 1st. I would appreciate a motion and second to approve the minutes. Commissioner Scharf and Commissioner Ranchard. Any comments, corrections? All those in favor of approving the minutes say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? It passes unanimously. Thank you. That brings me to my report. Thank you. Oh, it is here. I apologize. Usually have a separate document. Habits are hard, you know. I'm pleased to report that Governor Brown's appointment of Commissioner Sanjay Ranchad to the commission has been confirmed by the Senate. Congratulations and welcome in your full position. Thank you, sir. My general remarks will be short. There are two headlines in today's papers, I think of significance, quite different. I'm going to try and join them up. One is the very instructive headline and actually series of videos on the front page of the New York Times today on rising seas threat to Easter Island. Very far away from us. Doesn't have much effect on us. But I think it does demonstrate, one, the real problem of rising seas, which threaten actually to take out most of the value of Easter Island. Many of these statues are fairly close to the water, and the islands themselves are fairly low. And they are now opening up, the waves are opening up graves and taking things away, and ultimately taking away the economic viability of that area, as well as a world cultural heritage resource. Not much can be done to adapt Easter Island to that problem. Putting a seawall all the way around it is probably not an effective solution. It demonstrates, I think, the severity of the problem and the hard reality that even if we significantly increase our mitigation efforts regarding greenhouse gases, the seas are going to continue to rise, and there are areas that will have to be abandoned. The second set of headlines is quite different. It's the youth, the kids, who came out of school to protest over gun violence. Gun violence is not in our jurisdiction, but it is certainly a concern to all of us. But the important message from that, I believe, is that we have, across this country, a younger generation from elementary schools all the way up who are willing to stand up and say this isn't right, who are willing to stand up and say things need to change. A little child may well lead us. As you begin to hear more and more about the efforts of our education working group, the fourth wave of our efforts to determine what we can do to adapt to rising tides, to protect our built and natural environments, what we should do, and how we're going to pay for it. You're going to hear increasing emphasis on reaching out to youth, to schools, because while we will obviously address stakeholders, cities, counties, regional agencies, organizations. Real change, particularly change that has to occur over long periods of time, as these changes to adapt to rising sea levels will, require the support of the young people who are going to inherit these problems from us. And as I've said before, the reason we have, yes, they're here, the recycling bins in all public areas and in many, many private businesses today is not due to the wisdom of agencies like ours. It is due to the fact that the children were educated and came home and said, why are we doing this to our environment? Small travel note. I was in the Indonesian Ocean snorkeling for 12 days on a gorgeous yacht chartered by the Oceanic Society. And in the ocean and on islands as remote as one can imagine, you saw the plastic debris that is polluting the oceans and the land around them. Most of it not coming from here, to be honest. But it is still an issue. One of the things they gave us on that boat to remind us about the problem was metal straws. So you don't have to take the plastic straw, which may not make its way into the ocean here, but will still make it into landfill where it doesn't need to be. There are things we can all do. There's education we can need to do. We've got face major problems here, and there is hope. Our next meetings. Next meeting will be held April 5th, where we may hold a briefing on the State Ocean Protection Council on its updated guidance regarding estimates of future sea level rise, certainly of importance. We may consider a report by Caltrans on the implosions of footings of the old east span of the Bay Bridge. We may hold a staff briefing on the work plan to help carry out our strategic plan. And we may hold a briefing by the Bay Planning Coalition on bay boating and marinas. That brings me to ex parte communications. Today, this may be slightly more serious than it is at other times. Many of us have received correspondence on the West Harbor issue. In my review of the ones I've received, they have all been sent to the executive director and therefore posted. However, if anyone here has received ones they think that is not true or has had personal conversations which have not been reported, you may, and I would argue should, report them now, although you also need to do so in writing. Commissioner Pine.
I'll just note that I did report through the disclosure forms a number of ex parte communications.
Thank you. Nobody else. That turns us to the report of the executive director.
Thank you, Chair Wasserman. Commissioner Pine, if you could turn off your tube. There you go. Last time we met, I described how putting together an agenda for a BCDC meeting can be difficult, but today's was not. For the first time in my memory, the Commission will hold a meeting to concentrate on only one enforcement case, and as you can see, there are plenty of participants. I am pleased to let you know that BCDC has been provided with the $500,000 in cap and trade funds that we expected late last year. We're using them in a variety of regulatory and planning projects. I'll give you a full budget report as soon as possible on them and overall. I'm also very happy to let you know that members of our senior staff have interviewed two very solid candidates to fill the role of Policy and Planning Director, and I hope that we shall have an announcement for you within a couple weeks. Meanwhile, we have welcomed our newest Sea Grant Fellow, the marvelous program sponsored by NOAA, which costs a relatively small amount of state funds and provides BCDC and the Bay with a big bang for the buck. Jackie Mondosky earned her BS in aquatic, there she is standing back there, earned her BS in aquatic biology from UC Santa Barbara, and then earned her master's degree in marine biodiversity and conservation from the magnificent Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego, so says the old San Diegan. So she converted from a gaucho to a Triton. Before joining BCDC, Jacqueline worked at the City of San Diego to implement its climate action plan and at the Wade Institute on the issue of sustainable ocean management. She has researched and dived in California, the Caribbean, and the South Pacific, so we welcome her. I also need to let you know that we're sad to be losing Elena Perez. You'll remember that Elena is one of the 2 BCDC staff members who provided you with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity briefing last month. On the other hand, I'm very happy to let you know that Elena has earned a Fulbright scholarship, and she'll be working in the Galapagos starting next month. From sadness to good news, Andrew Chin, our CIO, was awarded the California Chief Information Officer Academy Information Technology Leadership Award, which barely fits on a plaque. He was one of 3 staffers, only 3 staffers in the California Natural Resources Agency to earn the honor, and one of 48 award recipients from among all state IT employees. Simply put, Andrew has been and continues to be a lifesaver in many technological ways. He demonstrates creativity and leadership daily. He allows us to use cloud-based services and software to increase our limited technological capacity. He figures out how to explain things to staff members who aren't as technologically savvy, and he certainly deserves the award. With regard to policy, I want to give you all a heads up that we'll be revising the hearing dates included in the brief descriptive notice for the Bay Plan amendments. The good news is we're making progress, starting with input from the Bayfield Working Group this morning, and soon the newly formed Environmental Justice Commission Working Group. New Commissioner Teresa Alvarado, along with Commissioner Vasquez, have agreed to be part of that working group. We have one more person yet to ask. We will give you a full update on the progress of both amendments in May. In addition, BCDC has applied for NOAA grant funds to support the 3rd Bay Plan amendment to amend our mitigation policies, which was identified last July by the commissioners as the next priority. Next week, Steve Goldbeck, Mark Zeppatello, and I shall be in Washington, D.C. with our counterparts from the California Coastal Commission and Coastal Conservancy to attend the annual Coastal States Organization meeting and NOAA's annual training with representatives from the nation's other 31 coastal states. On Wednesday, we shall visit a number of members of our Bay Area congressional delegation and/or their staffs to talk about NOAA, its funding base, regional planning, and other major issues. Work continues to be very busy for Andrea Gaffney, our dedicated Bay design analyst. Andrea has approved a variety of projects around the Bay during the past month, including trails and a classroom at Cooley Landing Park, Wind River public access overlooks in Alameda, the new ferry terminal plaza at San Francisco's Pier 2, and new interpretive signage that was designed in collaboration with students from Oracle High School. And I think you have copies of that in your packet. And it's absolutely marvelous that the students participated and indeed led the effort. And it certainly fits within what BCDC has done with regard to access around the high school. Meanwhile, during the past few weeks, we have bombarded you with a slew of material. I hope that you have found or will find time to read the following. First, this is a copy of the handout we'll distribute in Washington of the letter that we and the Coastal Commission and the Coastal Conservancy drafted in opposition to the President's proposed budget item that zeroes out funding for NOAA's Coastal Zone Management Program, whose purpose is to ensure that there's a robust collaboration among all levels of government. Second, I'd like to point out the letter from the California Coastal Conservancy to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in support of San Francisco Bay being selected as one of 10 projects in the Corps' pilot program to increase the beneficial reuse of sediment. You'll remember that our 2 agencies with Save the Bay Institute, and the Bay Planning Coalition helped draft the provision in the Corps' latest authorizing legislation that authorizes the program and mandates that the federal standard cannot be used as an excuse not to fund such beneficial reuse. We hope that application will be successful. Last week, we distributed a couple newspaper articles. The first, by Paul Rogers in the Mercury News, describes a new study on subsidence along the Bay shoreline. Mr. Rogers quoted Steve Goldbeck at the article's conclusion, and we very much appreciate that he reached out to BCDC to help his readers better understand the context. Finally, I want you to please read this article because I want you to keep up to date on the ongoing trial in San Diego County for the coastal commissioners accused of not disclosing ex parte matters. 2 final points to make. First, you will soon receive an email from Reggie Abad. Where is Reggie? Is Reggie here? Standing right outside there. He is compiling a list of emergency contact information to be used by Chair Wasserman and/or me should we need to contact you during a critical period. The information will not be made available to the public or the rest of BCDC staff. Reggie will provide you with a form. Feel free to use it or discard it as you wish. Finally, speaking of disclosure, I want to remind you all that your FPPC Form 700s are due on April 2nd, 18 days from now. 17 days from now. 18 days from now. Currently, only 9 commissioners have submitted the required forms. Please do not delay. That concludes my report, Chair Wasserman. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions for the executive director? No.
I think you want to make clear those forms are due at the end of the month, so the folks who haven't filed haven't violated anything.
April 2.
Right.
April 2. 18 days.
Item 7, I count myself in that group. Item 7 is consideration of administrative matters. Brad McCray sent to us the administrative listing on March 9th. Does anybody have any questions about administrative matters on that list? Off the hook once again. Thank you. Item 8 is a closed session regarding pending litigation regarding Mark Sanders and Westpoint Harbor LLC. Therefore, I am now asking the commissioners to join me in crossing the hall to the Claremont Room, which can be accessed through the boardroom directly across. Everyone else can remain here, talk amongst yourselves as you like, and we will rejoin you as soon as we are finished. Commissioners, please ensure that when you come across, all electronic equipment is off, so we are not broadcasting in any way. Estimate of time?
Leave it to you.
Anybody want to venture a guess?
Over under.
5 minutes.
I'm sorry? Nobody wants to step out there? I'm going to say it's going to be 45 minutes. That's only a rough guess. I don't quite know fully what we're going to be told, and I don't know how many questions there are going to be. I would be surprised if it's less than that.
Chair Wasserman,
Yes.
do we need to bring any of this with us?
Need to? No.
Should
Depends
we?
on your level of dependence on written material.
It might be helpful if you have any questions.
The answer to your question is yes, bring it, please. Thank you very much. We will return as soon as we can. There was no action taken in the closed session.
That's disappointing.
That brings us to the matter on the recommendation of the Enforcement Committee regarding Mark Sanders and Westpoint Harbor LLC. It is my understanding, the process will be, we will hear from staff, we will hear from the respondent. Do I have the order right, David?
Yes.
Thank you. We will then hear from the public. We will then close the public hearing, and the commission will deliberate. Let's start out, however, by being clear about what the options for the commission today are and what the fundamental procedure is. David, please.
Chair and Board, I'm happy to do that. The Commission's options today are in Title 14 of California's Code of Regulations, Section 11332. Essentially, there are 4 options. 1, the Commission can adopt the recommended enforcement decision without any changes in the proposed cease and desist order. 2, the Commission could just dismiss the entire matter and dismiss the recommended enforcement decision and without adopting any particular order. 3, the Commission could remand the matter back to the Enforcement Committee for further action as the Commission directs. Or 4, the Commission could reject the recommended enforcement decision and to decide to consider the matter de novo. Thank you.
And the one other item that I think is important to note is that this is simply listening to the arguments. We are not hearing any evidence in this procedure. Any questions from the Commission at this level? Then I think staff is up to bat. And I'm sorry, the parties have agreed on 15 minutes each. And I would caution everybody, and this, I'm sorry, let me make one additional caution to the public. We want to hear from you. We may start losing commissioners between 4 and 4:30. I would hope that all of you would be inspired a little bit by the last speaker on general matters, that if you are basically reinforcing and repeating what's been said, you could say that without going on. I will allow the 2 minutes to stay for the members of the public each, but with the context that we could start losing commissioners, I would ask you to be as brief as possible. Now, you can start batting, Mark.
Chair Wasserman, Commissioners, Mr. Sanders, good afternoon. Mr. Sanders constructed Westpoint Harbor Marina from a portion of a former salt pond under a permit issued by this commission in 2003. The reason that we're here today is that Mr. Sanders has not done what he agreed to do under the permit. He has refused to comply with the contract that he entered into with the commission almost 15 years ago when he signed his permit. Like all other BCDC permits, the Westpoint Harbor permit requires that public access be provided prior to the use or occupancy of authorized structures. In this case, Mr. Sanders did the exact opposite. He pursued his development first, and he put off providing required public access till last. Specifically, under this permit, the trigger for providing public access and public access improvements was installation and use of what are referred to as the Phase 1B marina berths, and that occurred by no later than September of 2009. However, Mr. Sanders did not provide public access to the majority of the required public access areas or amenities until July of 2017, approximately 8 years after required to do so by the permit. To this date, Mr. Sanders has not obtained approval of required plans for signage, for public walkways, for landscaping, or for site furnishings. Mr. Sanders has failed to install most of 170,000 square feet of landscaping as required by the permit, or all of the site furnishings required by the permit. He's failed to provide required visual barriers to the adjacent salt pond to the south. Despite his agreement to do so in a finding in the permit, he has failed to install required signs and buoys in Westpoint Slough to protect wildlife, including conditions that were imposed at the request of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to protect the adjacent National Wildlife Refuge. He's also failed to provide required shorebird roosting habitat or to fully implement a wetlands mitigation plan that he submitted to the Corps of Engineers, but not to BCDC in 2003. And finally, he has installed numerous unauthorized structures in the bay and in dedicated public access areas. BCDC staff inspected the site in 2011 following a complaint that was forwarded to staff by a commissioner that a member of the public had been denied public access to the site. In May 2011, BCDC notified Mr. Sanders of numerous permit violations at the site, and for the past 7 years, staff has attempted to work with Mr. Sanders to resolve the violations. Between 2012 and 2015, staff prepared 5 different versions of a proposed permit amendment that would have addressed many of his concerns, and each of which he refused to sign. Since 2003, Mr. Sanders has received the benefit of his permit. He's developed and profited from his marina, while the public was denied required access and public access amenities, and while required environmental protections were not implemented. A brief comment on the proposed penalty. Staff aggregated 35 multiple violations into a total of 22 so as to avoid a claim of overcounting, and staff did not propose a penalty for 4 of the violations. The proposed penalty is what it is because of the large number of violations and the long duration over which they occurred. However, staff has no objection, as proposed or suggested by the Enforcement Committee, that Mr. Sanders have an opportunity to be entitled to a waiver of a substantial portion of the penalty if he complies with the order and with the permit. For the remainder of my presentation, I'll provide a brief orientation to the site and the timeline of the enforcement matter, discuss briefly the key provisions of the proposed order adopted by the Enforcement Committee, and present the staff's recommendation. The slide on the screen is a vicinity map which shows Westpoint Harbor on the right side, and to the south, and you can see some of the green, that's the remainder of Pond 10, South Pond, owned and operated by Cargill. To the east, the Pacific Shores Center that has public access along the slough that is intended and now connects to Westpoint Harbor. And approximately a little less than 300 yards across the slough is Greco Island and the wetlands of the National Wildlife Refuge. Here's a closer up map of the Google Earth image of the site. I'll just point out a few of the site features. The marina itself and the public access improvements are phase 1 of the project. Phase 2 is the boatyard to the east, and phase 3 is the future retail areas to the west. The guest docks are along the west side of the marina basin. The unauthorized rowers dock that is discussed is the 101 surf sports facility here. Mr. Sanders and his supporters are now saying that there is plenty of public access at the site. However, he only opened the public access, or the majority of it, after being informed that staff was initiating an formal enforcement process. As recently as last June, there were members-only signs at the marina entrance. There were restricted access signs blocking the way, well, not blocking, but discouraging cars from driving down here. There was a restricted access sign on the trail here so that you couldn't walk this way. The public access along this side of the marina basin was blocked with a gate. The connection to Pacific Shores was blocked with a gate. This is the site plan, the public access site plan that's part of the permit, and it shows that all the shaded areas are dedicated public access, including the paths around the perimeter of the marina. The guest docks are dedicated public access. The boat launch is dedicated public access. The timeline, in May, as I mentioned earlier, of 2011, staff notified Mr. Sanders of numerous violations. One of Mr. Sanders' concerns was that he didn't want the public walking along the undeveloped Phase 3 future development sites. So although staff didn't think fencing was required, an agreement was reached early in 2012 with Redwood City and Mr. Sanders to install temporary fencing. Staff prepared a permit amendment that would have authorized that and made a number of other changes. Mr. Sanders had problems, so staff prepared several more versions of the proposed amendment over the next few years. In version 4, In September 2014, staff sent a 22-page letter responding to Mr. Sanders' comments and explaining why they couldn't make certain changes administratively. We got no response to amendment number 5, the 5th version. Shortly after that, Mr. Sanders' former counsel died, so there was no response. But during this time period, Mr. Sanders had applied for an amendment for the boatyard, and staff proposed that the changes for Amendment 5 be incorporated. Mr. Sanders declined and said his goal was to get authorization for his boatyard. So once again, development came first and public access last. In December of 2016, staff informed Mr. Sanders that it was preparing a violation report. Mr. Sanders said, well, if public access is important, I'll apply for amendment and get a fence up, which is how 5 years after an agreement was reached for fencing was finally installed, and he opened the majority of the public access areas in July of last year. I'm just going to go very quickly through the terms of the proposed order. One major section requires that all of the Phase 1B and Phase 2 public access areas be opened and available for unrestricted public access. Another section requires submissions of plans that are required by the permit. A signage plan. Mr. Sanders submitted a signage plan last year that was rejected. Staff provided comments. 8 months later, he has not submitted a revised signage plan. There's also signage plans needed for the walkways, for the landscaping, for the site furnishings. One section of the proposed order requires removal of unauthorized improvements in public access areas. Another section requires the installation, requires that he submit an application to amend the permit to request after-the-fact authorization for a number of improvements. These are things where staff is not asking that these things be removed, but just that the permit needs to be amended. The permit requires installation of the buoys and signs as required by the permit, and some of the other mitigation requirements intended to protect fish and wildlife and the refuge. One of the key terms is the submission of monthly status reports and further review by the Enforcement Committee, which we thought would be a useful means to ensure compliance and track this going forward. I discussed the penalty previously, and I'm sensitive to time. I'd like to talk briefly about the penalty factors. The recommended enforcement decision contains a detailed analysis of the penalty factors. I would just highlight a few. This matter has been a very high cost to the state for enforcement. Over 2,000 hours is estimated in staff time. Mr. Sanders has benefited economically from the violations by not providing public access sooner, by not obtaining plan review for improvements. Some public commenters have expressed concern that the marina might be closed because of this enforcement action. We requested economic information, financial information from Mr. Sanders last year. He refused to provide any and asserted that ability to pay was not a relevant factor. I'd like to talk just about failure to cooperate. Failure to cooperate over the period from 2011 to 17 is one thing, and you'll hear perhaps Respondents' Counsel say there's no evidence of intentional violations because nobody has submitted a declaration under penalty of perjury that they were denied access. Well, prior to the violation report is one thing, but since last July, Mr. Sanders has done nothing to come into compliance. As examples, no signage plan. He's failed to remove an unauthorized sign at the boat launch that charges a fee and requires a permit from the Harbor Master building. You might ask Mr. Sanders why that is, why he's refused to cooperate. Last spring, staff was told that Mr. Sanders had hired a landscape architect to prepare a revised signage plan and other required plans. Instead, he's hired a team of litigators, and it appears that he has decided to litigate rather than work with the commission and staff. So I would offer just a few comments on the litigation option, Mr. Sanders. If you choose to sue, you will still need to comply with the permit unless you get, and the order, unless you get a court to stay the order. And the court will consider the probability of success on the merits and the potential for irreparable harm. On the probability of success on the merits, I think it's fair to say it's an uphill battle to get a court to agree that you don't have to comply with your permit. And as for irreparable harm, we will submit statements by the Fish and Wildlife Service about the need for buoys and signs and the hazards for planting trees along the slough, and the comments that public is still being denied access to the kayak launch, to the boat launch. On the merits, there's substantial evidence to support the Commission's decision. If it's not too late, Mr. Sanders, I would like to make a final appeal to you to consider the alternative, which is to work with staff and work with the Commission and the Enforcement Committee. If you put in as much effort into compliance as litigation, this would be largely behind you in a year. Turning to the staff's recommendation, the staff recommends that the Commission reject the Enforcement Committee's recommended enforcement decision. The staff further recommends that the Commission consider the matter de novo and that proposes that the staff will submit a modified proposed order substantially identical to the modified order that the staff proposed to the Enforcement Committee, subject to additional modifications by direction from the Commission here today. To explain the basis for the staff's position, I just will explain a few of the principal modifications we made in the order submitted to the Enforcement Committee in January. A number of the modifications made the order less onerous and more favorable to Mr. Sanders. The modified order would allow more time to complete a number of plans and submissions under the order. There were some improvements in the public access area where in the modified order, we would allow Mr. Sanders to apply for an amendment to leave those improvements even though they're in the public access area so that he wouldn't be required to move them immediately. This includes the community garden and a storage shed. Mr. Sanders claims the postcard will not authorize buoys and signs in the slough, but there's no evidence he even applied. So the modified order, rather than directing installation of the signs and buoys, would require him to apply to the Coast Guard, and if the permission is denied, to come up with an alternative and seek a permanent amendment. The modified order would allow for an extension of time provision so that the executive director could grant reasonable requests for extension of any of the deadlines. The modified order also expands upon the requirement for submission of monthly reports and further reports by the further hearings before the Enforcement Committee. We would propose 2 subsequent hearings by the Enforcement Committee in 6 months and a year. And tied to that, the civil penalty provision would be modified to allow for a waiver of a portion of the penalty as determined by the committee, not by staff, not by the executive director. And it would provide for a waiver if substantial compliance as determined by the committee. Mr. Sanders, I just have 1 more minute. Mr. Sanders, you may think the waiver provision is illusory and provides a false expectation of a waiver and puts too much discretion to the staff, but I would suggest to you that the opposite is true. Those provisions for monthly reporting and 2 further hearings by the Enforcement Committee put the focus on the staff as well as on you. Those provisions give you the opportunity to hold staff accountable on both points. Staff will have a strong incentive to work with you cooperatively and reasonably because we will all be coming back to the Enforcement Committee twice for the Enforcement Committee to assess compliance. Finally, the revised proposed order would make a number of changes in response to evidentiary objections raised by respondents. As 2 examples, the committee's proposed order that's before you states in a number of places that the violations resulted in adverse impacts to biological resources. In response to counsel's arguments that we haven't proved harm, the modified order would revise the language to say the violations likely resulted in harm. That's sufficient. Staff doesn't have to prove harm. We just have to prove failure to comply with the permit conditions. As another example, the respondents argue there's no evidence of knowing and intentional conduct, and we deleted those provisions from the modified order in a number of places. Finally, I'd comment on the 2 options available to you if you choose not to adopt the Enforcement Committee's recommendation are either to remand to the Enforcement Committee or to hear the matter de novo. We would urge you to hear the matter de novo for 3 reasons. First, we believe that judicial review will be clearer and cleaner if the order is adopted by the full commission. Second, If the commission hears the matter de novo, you will be able to make modifications to the order as late as the hearing, rather than being presented with an order from the Enforcement Committee that you will have to accept without modification. And finally, and importantly, given the complete lack of cooperation and failure to move forward to compliance, there is some level of urgency in getting an order adopted. We believe that irreparable harm is occurring to wildlife and to public access. The Commission should adopt an order next month following one more hearing rather than remand to the Enforcement Committee, followed by Commission consideration at yet another meeting, perhaps not until May. The suggested motion that I would offer is that the Commission reject the Enforcement Committee's recommendation and decide that the Commission will consider the matter de novo. Thank you.
Thank you. The respondent has 18 minutes.
Zach, one thing, I want to make it clear to the respondent and the public, if the commission adopts the recommendation of the staff, the de novo hearing would not be today.
Correct.
That would be at another time. I just
Correct.
want to make sure everybody understands.
Thank you.
So members of the commission, Mr. Chairman, I'm Kevin Sadler of the Baker Botts Law Firm. I'm here with my colleague, Mr. Vickers and Mr. Carr. And of course, we represent Mr. Sanders.
Is your microphone on?
It is now.
Thank you.
It was a minute ago. And so I do not intend to give a detailed rebuttal to what Mr. Zeppatello just said. I did not bring a PowerPoint with me either. This matter has been fully briefed extensively. We filed a 123-page brief with detailed rebuttal of facts to all the assertions made by the staff in their charging document, backed up with hundreds of pages of evidence. I'm not going to repeat any of that here. That was all laid out in front of the Enforcement Committee. That's done. The record is closed. There's no more evidence. What Mr. Zeppatello talked about at this hearing today, Mr. Sanders said this, Mr. Sanders felt that. If it's not in your record, it didn't happen. Documents submitted just in the last 2 or 3 weeks for your consideration, purporting to respond to public comment and offering new facts, new matters, that's not evidence before you. The record is closed. The matter is submitted. We have made a detailed response, binders and binders of documents, because we don't agree with the charges. And again, to my astonishment, I have heard yet additional criticism for the mere fact that Mr. Sanders would dare to hire lawyers and defend himself. We don't agree with that either. We have a right to defend ourselves. You have a right to enter whatever order you like. And we have a right to appeal. That's not a threat. That is just everyone standing on their rights. So we submit the matter to you. You have an election under 332. Mr. Alderson read it all to us. I agree with every word he said. The offer before you from the Enforcement Committee was adopt the order. Plain and simple. As is, where is, with all faults. Our view is don't adopt any order. Dismiss the complaint. Now we have apparently option 3, which is let's kick this can down the road. Let's have yet another hearing at huge expense and adopt perhaps something else, which sounds like an effort to tidy up a record that perhaps isn't quite as strong as you might like it to be. So we submit the matter to you. Make your election. Our point of view is quite clear. The recommended order that came to you today came to you over all of our objections. You adopt the order that's being recommended to do, you do so over all of our objections. you adopt another order that changes the language to help them, you do so over our objections. We submit it to you. Make your choice. Make your election.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, I'm just checking my cheat sheet. We'll now hear from the public. Not what this says.
That's correct.
We will now open the public hearing. I sit corrected. We have 27 speakers. I respect all of your rights to speak and simply ask that you avoid trying to be repetitive. First speaker is Maureen O'Connor Sanders. 2 minutes.
Thank you. I speak to counter and correct misinformation conveyed to the public by Mark Zappitello and Adrian Klein. Their statements that a series of attorneys and landscape architects with whom Mark Sanders has worked over the past 15 years left the Westpoint Harbor project due to problems working with Mark. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's misinformation. In terms of attorneys, Mark's first attorney, Kent Mitchell, worked with him for 15 years until his retirement. Doug Akins succeeded him and worked enthusiastically for 6 years. Doug Akins died of lymphoma, still supportive of Mark and Westpoint Harbor. David Smith succeeded Doug and has worked closely with the harbor. Since 2015, he has fully supported Mark's retaining Baker Botts, Mark's current attorneys, and attended both enforcement committee meetings, and David is here today. Misinformation. As for landscape architects, Mark originally used Tim Hurley for 10 years until Tim left his firm. Mark subsequently retained Kevin Stevens. Kevin tried for 2 years to work cooperatively with BCDC staff on landscaping. He finally exited the project utterly frustrated, trying to work with BCDC staff. He described numerous examples of verbal agreements with Ellen Miramontes and Adrian Klein in one meeting, only to have those decisions upended and overturned in the next. When told of Ms. Klein's claim that he left due to problems with Mark, Kevin's comment was, quote, "That's a lie," unquote, misinformation. Name-calling, demonizing permittees, attacking an individual's character, and using misinformation to create a false impression have no place here. They are desperate measures to divert attention from allegations that are not evidence-based and to avoid responsibility for a failed process. They are vindictive and they are harassment.
Thank you. Your time is up. I'm going to ask you not to applaud, please. We're trying to get through this. I understand your enthusiasm. The next speaker is Matthew Sanders, and the one after that is Barry Geckhart. Gellhart? Gerhart. Mr. Sanders.
Thank you. Just a few comments about my dad. He's an engineer. He loves to build things. He loves to fix things, and he's certainly not afraid of complicated projects. He's a sailor. He loves boats. My sister and I were on boats since before we could walk. It's a family passion. We grew up living in harbors, and since I was a kid, watching my dad work towards his goal of building a marina. He's built companies, he's saved companies, and spent all of his success towards Westpoint Harbor. Since we were kids, he's always instilled in us the values of courage, doing the right thing, and integrity. So I find it insulting that Mr. Guzman would accuse him of endangering the environment and cutting corners to minimize or maximize a profit. There is nothing monetarily that's gone back to my dad from Westpoint Harbor. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gerhardt, and following that, and I apologize, Pauline Ridges-Nars? But first is Mr. Gerhardt.
You're first.
Barry Gerhardt first. I'm trying to line you up so that we can help hear all of you as fully as possible.
I'm Barry Gerhardt. I had a bunch of prepared remarks. I have spent hours going over the pages and reams of documents. I'd like to ask you ladies and gentlemen, how many of the commissioners themselves have actually been to Westpoint Harbor? Can I get a show of hands?
I know.
Anyone? Okay, so I've been there for 6 years. And in that time, I've watched Mr. Sanders pull his hair out and go, well, we got this paper here, and we got this paper here. They're conflicted. I wish the picture of the harbor were still there. So I could show you where I wasn't allowed to go, let alone the public. And a lot of that had to do with Redwood City and building permits and under construction. And I'm trying to wrap my mind around how all of this is not reasonable. The Pond 10, I've got pictures on my phone, and it's full of birds, wading birds, they're always there. Delta smelt, pelicans, they're all there. The seals. Public access, thank you. I think that what we have here is something strange, and I would like you, I don't know what your options 1, 2, 3, or 4 are, but I think if you go with the findings as they currently stand, you'd all be complicit in extortion. And I mean, that's just me. Born and raised in the Santa Clara Valley. All right, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, sir. Pauline, and you're going to correct me on the last name, please. And following her is Rob Cran.
My name is Pauline Ridges-Nars. I know that's a hard one. And I'm a friend of Westpoint Harbor. Like the BCDC, our core values are protecting our environment, preserving our natural resources, and sharing Westpoint Harbor with our entire community. Friends of Westpoint Harbor have secured over 5,000 signatures on a petition, right here, with a call to action to dismiss all allegations and proposed fines against Westpoint Harbor, to investigate BCDC enforcement actions and fines by the California legislature and state auditor, to support BCDC for rights of equal access to the bay for all relevant water-oriented recreation sports, groups, I should say, and the appointment of independent and objective party to review the BCDC versus Westpoint Harbor case. We, Friends of Westpoint Harbor, have done our own research and have distributed a comprehensive position paper. You all should have received a copy. The bottom line of all of this is that the facts do not support the allegations. After months of seeing a bad situation become even worse, it is time to act. We call on you to vote against the proposed cease and desist order. Vote no today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Cran, followed by Brenda Hattery.
Hello, my name is Rob Kren. I'm a native of the Bay Area, and I'm a friend of Westpoint Harbor. In the 6 years beginning May 2011, Westpoint Harbor met with the BCDC at least 9 different times and created 5 different versions of amended permits. In September 2014, this cooperative effort reached a point at which 44 material errors and conflicts were corrected. This was Amendment 5, and it was signed by BCDC Regulatory Director Brad McRae. Many of the issues you hear today are already resolved by those years of hard work. But at the 11th hour, Adrian Klein added some new and deal-breaking conditions. Number 1, all fines must be paid from the time of an allegation was made until it was proven wrong. Number 2, Westpoint Harbor must comply with BCDC's demands even in the event of conflicts with other agencies. And number 3, Westpoint Harbor must waive its right to seek justice in court. It's this sort of behavior that drives the process to litigation. So we call on you to vote against the proposed CDO, and please vote no today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Brenda Hattery, followed by David Hattery.
My name is Brenda Hattery, and I'm a friend of Westpoint Harbor. We believe the allegations against the harbor are unfounded, and that the reasons that they're even possible is because of behavior within BCDC. Other friends here will tell you about problems like factual inaccuracies, mistakes exaggerating, jurisdictional conflicts, as well as BCDC demands that will hurt the environment, safety, or public access if the BCDC demands were completed. 19 of the 23 allegations are built wholly or in part on process problems. Those include losing or ignoring paperwork, not following internal administrative processes at BCDC, like reviewing submitted documents, and subjectively reinterpreting the permit at any time. This amended permit includes at least 44 identified errors, and staff has little incentive to remove the errors. I believe it's because they provide leverage and enforcement traps. So now staff has alleged things like 12-foot wide paths were intended everywhere. The rowing center is authorized no dock. The public gets unlimited access 24/7, and the project's initial CEQA must be ignored. BCDC won't acknowledge or review the submittals made, but now allege, long after construction, that no plan submittals were made. BCDC refuses to accept permittee proof of compliance, yet relies upon citizen reports rather than doing their own inspections of the site. This is a broken process. We call on you to vote against the proposed CDO, against kicking the can down the road. Just drop it, please. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. David Hattery, followed by Richard Weber.
I'm also a friend of Westpoint Harbor. Exaggerating and reaching by BCDC was found in 17 of the 23 allegations. So many examples, so little time. Behind the dumpsters, there's a small utility shed that BCDC claims is blocking a public access view. You can't see the shed because the dumpsters are in the way, and besides, who wants to be looking behind dumpsters for a view? This is reaching for a violation. BCDC actually wants no view on the entire dumpster side of the harbor. They are claiming insufficient visual barriers between Westpoint Harbor and the roof space. Ironically, a roof space Westpoint Harbor created from a bittern pond that, in other allegations, BCDC claims was never even created. Drawings show that the existing barrier exceeds permit requirements, but now BCDC wants an aesthetically pleasing barrier. Notwithstanding the complete absence of aesthetic in the permit, the existing barrier as it stands is both effective and pleasing. Roosting birds are unfazed by the distant people, and the people enjoy watching the birds at roost. This is an example of exaggerating and reaching for a violation, not to mention reinterpreting the permit and conflicting claims. There are a couple of utility boxes that extend some inches into the wide public access paths. These sorts of things are hard to avoid, and changing the entire design of the facility to account for a couple of boxes would no doubt ruin the overall aesthetic of the facility. I see these types of incursions on the Bay Trail everywhere. This is reaching for a violation. There were construction zones that Redwood City required be off limits for public safety, yet BCDC recently decided that public shore signs welcoming public visitors into those dangerous areas and public benches and chairs were required in the construction zone during construction. Really? This is reaching for a violation as well as a jurisdictional conflict. We call upon you to vote against this CDO. Vote today, vote no. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Richard Weber, followed by Marianne Tracy.
Thank you, Commissioners, for the time to talk to you. My name is Richard Weber. I'm also a friend of Westpoint Harbor. I wanted to point out some factual inaccuracies that are in the cease and desist order, which is before you at this time, which astonishingly, apparently now the Enforcement Committee is asking you to vote down in order to take a de novo approach, which in myself is amazing. But I want you to know what's in that order that you are being asked to vote on, because it contains significant inaccuracies, one of which is a fine for the lack of approval and planning for a fuel dock, as well as the fact that apparently alleged the fuel dock is larger than approved. Commissioners, there is no fuel dock. There has never been a fuel dock. In fact, if you were to go to Westpoint Harbor at any time up to now and including now, you will find no fuel pumps, no fuel pipes, no fuel tanks, nothing related to fuel dispensing. And yet the cease and desist order that is in front of you at this moment is requesting and requiring a $30,000 penalty for this violation. Frankly, there's no wonder that they do not want you to vote on this. It's riddled with inaccuracies, riddled with mistakes. And quite honestly, I don't think you should have any expectation that a future order would be any more accurate. So at this point, I call on you in good conscience, not only to vote no on this order, but to dismiss it entirely on the basis you cannot have any expectation that what's going to come in front of you will be any better constructed. Thank you very much.
Marianne Tracy, followed by Ashley O'Healy.
Honorable Commissioners, thank you very much for your time today. My name is Marianne Tracy, and I'm a friend of Westpoint Harbor and a longtime resident of Redwood City. Several of the demands made by the BCDC will actually make matters worse than better for the overall environment and safety of the harbor. For example, in Allegation 5 regarding public parking signs, the BCDC staff states that upright signs clearly visible to the public were needed for parking spaces, which are currently marked with paint on pavement. Not only is this requirement not listed in the permit, but upright signs would create a perch for birds of prey, which would endanger some of the protected wildlife that currently thrive in the harbor and nearby Greco Island. Allegation 1 includes leaving public access restrooms unlocked after office hours, despite the fact that the BCDC agreed to this request in April of 2012. This would decrease the safety of the harbor and its residents, especially since these restroom facilities include showers. Even public parks lock their restrooms at night. Why should the harbor be any different? And in Allegation 7, BCDC is asking that the current signs installed on the edge of Greco Island informing boaters that access is prohibited be replaced by a series of buoys. Not only were the current signs endorsed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and approved by BCDC's own Tom Sinclair, but many of the proposed buoys would be useless at low tide and not visually effective for kayakers and paddlers. Therefore, I ask you to vote no today and make a decision in favor of the environment, safety, and Westpoint Harbor. Thank you.
Ashley O'Healy, followed by Allison O'Healy.
Hi, I'm Ashley O'Healy. I've been at West Point for 6 years. It's great because it's a clean marina. We even have a harbor seal. Her name is Emily. I've been to other marinas and they aren't clean, but they get to lock their gates and bathrooms. I think we should get to lock our gates and bathrooms too so we can be safe. Please vote no on the proposed CDO. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allison O'Healy. Allison O'Healy, followed by Louis Adamo.
Okay. Hi, I'm Allison O'Healy. I've been at Westpoint for 6 years. I'm going to read your mission statement as printed on your website. Quote, its mission is to protect and enhance San Francisco Bay and to encourage the bay's responsible and productive use for this and future generations. I am the next generation, and I don't see how preventing gates and bathrooms from being locked for my safety has anything to do with protecting the bay. Garbage is a big problem. My environmental group cleans up bay shores and beaches, picking up over 30 pounds of trash in just a few hours. Over 3 million gallons of fuel makes its way into the bay each year. This is a problem. And runoff into the bay after storms is the source of a lot of pollution. This is a big problem. I would like to request that you redirect your efforts to protecting the bay from real problems, instead of unrelated issues like not locking gates. Please vote no on the proposed CDO. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Louis Adamo, followed by Louis Gatner.
My name is Louis Adamo, and I'm a friend of Westpoint Harbor. Several allegations by the BCDC against Westpoint demonstrate BCDC's lack of regard for other governmental jurisdictions, industry standards, or normal operating procedures. Let me highlight a few examples. BCDC alleges guest docks must be unlocked for non-boater pedestrian access when it is marina industry practice that gates are locked for security and safety reasons. Another is that BCDC alleges their navigation requirements to place markers and buoys in the middle of an active channel must take precedence over the U.S. Coast Guard and the City of Redwood City. A third is that BCDC alleges that certain tree species would have a negative impact on the local wildlife when just 5 years earlier they accepted the same trees as the appropriate choice. In their lust to collect fines and penalties, the BCDC seems to have forgotten how to coexist with other jurisdictions and practices. We call on you to vote against the proposed CDO. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Louis Gatner, followed by Peter Blackmores.
It was Louis. I got his last name wrong. So Louis is the same person who just spoke. So Peter, you're next.
Sorry, I apologize for being complicit in the error. You're up, sir. And next is...
Good afternoon. My name is Peter Blackmore, friend of Westwood Harbour. So, Commissioners, thank you for the opportunity to speak at this hearing. I think it's abundantly clear that this is a complex and difficult situation. The staff of BCDC believe they have a strong case. There are a lot of people, many of whom are represented here, who have a totally different view. So my comments are personally to address the Commissioners. You have a difficult job by any standards. I've been a successful businessman. I've had the privilege of sitting on many boards. In the course of that career, I too have had difficult decisions to make as a board member. What I've experienced is that there is no substitute for going to get all the facts and see all the points of view. And I emphasize this is never out of disrespect to the staff who prepared a recommendation. Rather, it is to do with good governance. Because only by seeing all the facts and taking a first-hand view are you able to make a decision in a very complex environment. To that point, I'm saddened that up to now, very few of the commissioners have had a chance to go and see the marina and take the time and trouble to look at themselves. I believe that's a fundamental request. Like everybody else, I hope that you reject the allegation and turn it down, and we can all move forward. But at the very least, I urgently request, if you don't do that, go and see for yourselves. There is too much at stake here. The reputation of BCDC, the future of a very fine marina that meets any standards. So please, do think about that seriously. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, sir. Weeman. I'm sure I'm not doing that right, and I apologize, followed by Gail Robb.
Hello, my name is Max, and I represent Friends of Westpoint Harbor.
Conservation and thoughtful development are not conflicting things. You can do thoughtful development along the shoreline. So we removed bittern from the 110-acre pond before we created the 50 acres on the part I purchased. So as a consequence, the remainder of the pond has been a roost habitat and has been maintained by Cargill for that purpose for the last 16 years.
This is a wonderful water-oriented use.
We test our water every twice a year. It actually tests cleaner than the bay itself. Westpoint Harbor has almost a mile of new bay trail, 10 foot wide throughout the harbor. The pond, which was used to store chemical bittern, is now long gone, and we have a new basin.
As I look at Westpoint Harbor today, I'm absolutely delighted how well it turned out.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Gail Robb, followed by Raymond Durazo.
Chairman Wasserman and Commissioners, I'm Gail Robbie. I'm representing the Citizens Committee to Complete the Refuge. We would like to convey our strong support for the Enforcement Committee's recommended enforcement decision to ensure that Westpoint Harbor complies with all BCDC permit conditions. Citizens Committee is a nonprofit organization of volunteers dedicated to the protection of the bay and particularly concerned with environmental impacts to the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. Citizens Committee originally commented in support of the proposed Westpoint Marina project based on the strength of the required protections included in the 2001 Redwood City Mitigated Negative Declaration and the seeming willingness of Westpoint Harbor to implement these crucial environmental mitigations that were recommended by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Many of these mitigation measures were incorporated as special conditions in the permit BCDC issued to Westpoint Harbor in 2003. It's unacceptable that during 10 years of operation, the harbor continued to violate important BCDC permit conditions to protect bay natural resources. Westpoint Harbor maintains that there has been no harm to the environment. We disagree. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Endangered Species Division concluded that provided that Westpoint Marina project is, quote, implemented as described, it's not likely to adversely affect the endangered California clapper rail, salt marsh harvest mouse, and California least tern found on nearby Greco Island in the adjacent salt pond. BCDC must assume that it's equally true that Westpoint Harbor's consistent failure to implement the protective measures required in the permit creates unacceptable risks and likely adverse impacts to these species and their habitats. In granting Westpoint Harbor's permit, BCDC found that the project would protect bay resources because of this permit's special conditions. BCDC is responsible for ensuring that measures outlined in the Westpoint Harbor permit are put in place as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Robbie. Raymond Durazo, followed by Camila El Najib Wahab.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Ray Durazo, and I'm Vice President of the Recreational Boaters of California, RBOC. RBOC is a 50-year-old nonprofit organization representing the state's 3 million recreational boaters. RBOC strongly urges the Commission to summarily reject the proposed cease and desist order with regard to Westpoint Harbor. The claimed violations all suffer from one or more deficiencies that have been well documented by the Harbor, as well as by our letter to the Commission of November 15th, 2017.
RBOC's concerns with BCDC's actions toward the harbor are exacerbated when considered in the context of the Commission's similar enforcement actions against Scott's Restaurant in Jack London Square and against Sweeney's Duck Club in the Delta. Taken together, the pattern is alarming to the boating community and has also led a county superior court judge in a recent case to opine that BCDC enforcement had exceeded its jurisdiction, had inflicted excessive fines, and had displayed vindictive prosecution. RBOC urges the California State Legislature and State Auditor to investigate the BCDC enforcement actions, including the exorbitant fines that are being imposed. RBOC has held meetings in the state capitol with our elected officials regarding the Westpoint situation and our request for an audit. We have found a receptive audience, and we will continue to push forward in this regard in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Camila Najib Wahab, followed by Helen Horn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Camila Najib Wahab, and I represent the Committee for Green Foothills. We are a nonprofit organization whose mission is to protect open spaces and our natural environment in the San Mateo and Santa Clara counties. Our organization here is to voice concern about the possible harm to migratory shorebirds that nest near and around the harbor. The Greco Island is a common nesting area for migratory shorebirds. The ridge-ray rail is one of the species in particular of concern because it is a federally endangered, it's federally protected as endangered. Installing and maintaining no wake signs was one of the conditions of the permit, and that was done to ensure that there is no disruption of the feeding patterns of the migratory bird population. There is only a 4-hour window in which the birds may feed during low tide. If there is a disruption to the area from wakes caused by boating, the birds will not be able to eat, thus causing detrimental harm to their livelihood. The fact that there were no wake signs for boaters for many years means that these endangered birds may have been negatively impacted. The Committee for Green Foothills strongly encourages the BCDC to enforce the terms of the issued permits to ensure that the habitat of migratory birds are protected and conserved. Thank you.
Thank you. Helen Horn, followed by Edward Stansel.
Hello, my name is Helen Horn, and I'm a third-generation Redwood City resident. My grandfather was born there when my grandparents were living and working there in 1890. I've been on the water my whole life. My dad bought his first boat after he learned how to sail it from a guy when he was only 16 when he graduated from Sequoia. When he went into Stanford, he swam, he taught people how to sail, he swam the Golden Gate, got trophies, filled the attic from swimming Golden Gate in just swim trunks with the races that the Call Bulletin newspaper put on. I am also a friend of Westpoint by just being a friend. I'm a sailor, a surfer, a swimmer. I have 3 boats and 3 harbors. I bet that none of you would go to any of those harbors and find that there was, I just sold my 4th boat, that you would find any of those harbors had open bathrooms. None of them are open. The Don Edwards facility that we were talking about here has a locked bathroom. Nobody's been able to access it. Redwood City allowed the Pete's Harbor to put trailers on the end of that where the only access would be to the water, and they allowed them to block the access to the water. They're still there, selling apartments on the other harbor that they built. They eliminated 3 harbors. Harbors have gone down the wayside. Palo Alto silted in and they never redid it, full of marshy birds and everything. Alviso, they restored some of it. San Leandro's going. They closed Peninsula Marina with 400 boats. They closed Pete's Harbor. Now they have little boutique harbors with a couple of 3 or 4 boats. Thank you. I also support RBOC, and I think that you should start over on this to do the right thing because you're not getting the point that we really need harbors and we need places for people to hit the water. If you looked at that one wall where you had that projection of Greco Island and then the area where all those places are, Sims Metal has had 2 fires in the last 5 years there on holidays when nobody looks. started by who knows what plastics. And the other reason is nobody can hit the beach. You can't touch the beach anywhere from there all the way to the Muni Marina by foot. You have to go around or take a boat to get there. Thank you.
Thank you. Edward Stansel, followed by Paula Bozinovic.
Hi, my name's Edward Stansel, and Zachary, I had just a couple, when your opening statement just threw me off quite a bit. It was great that you went to Indonesia and found a straw when you're snorkeling on a deserted island. Came back from Panama. There was so much plastic on the streets, and the people who ride the bus, they just drink it, throw it out. They have an unconscionable thing going on. The kids might be able to help you work your smartphone, okay? But they can't teach you anything. The kids learn from adults and grandparents, okay? Otherwise, you'd be nowhere, okay? So the whole deal with the, I think that the Easter Island could be out of BCDC's jurisdiction.
Only a little bit.
Okay, along with Indonesia. But the reason that another thing I wanted to point out to you is that when you read something in a newspaper, it's already 48 hours old. And that's because it has to fly to Indonesia, be put on a disc, and come back and be typeset, okay? So they don't do typesetting anymore in America. So all your news is 48 hours old. But so don't think that you're cutting edge. But the other deal is, you do have a good point on the fact that there's faith in our youth. But we've already sold out our youth for all the money that they're going to have to work the rest of their life to get nothing. So let's go ahead and take a hard look at this. You're the parent, Mark's the unruly child. Let's pull him back in line. Let's have a group hug. And if you guys would go down in the harbor, you would see what a great job he's doing. Thank you very much.
Yes, you would.
Bozinovic, followed by Christopher Ressler.
It's pretty darn good. Not many people get my last name. Hello.
It's a close call. Go ahead.
Strictly phonetic, I always say. First of all, good afternoon. My name is Paula Bozinovic, and I won't take up a lot of time. But briefly, in looking through various items posted on this issue, I was kind of aghast at a message that I found on, it was basically an email generated by Adrian Klein on, let me see, Monday, 7/12/2010. And it was addressed to Tom Sinclair, and I just want to briefly read it. The subject is a question about the water trail. Tom, Westpoint Marina is going to be a big and juicy case for you because Mark Sanders, the principal, doesn't think too highly of us. This is one of your top priorities. Very interesting. So this is really prior to the timeline earlier presented by Mr. Zeppatello, hope I have that correctly, vis-a-vis the May 2011 violation letter. And I'm wondering if Adrian's correspondence is really kind of what set the stage for all of this. Not sure, but it's just a little bit odd. Working in industry a long time, I thought this correspondence was less than professional, at least by accepted standards in the industry. It's hostile, and it was particularly disconcerting because it was generated by a person that's paid by public tax dollars going after a business. Lastly, I just wanted to know what actions were being taken against businesses such as CEMEX and Sims, who has already been addressed, who are really major offenders at bay pollution and wildlife endangerment. What they generate from those places is horrific. And if you've not been down there, don't park your car too long because it'll be covered with ash and all kinds of unsightly things. Thank you.
Thank you. Christopher Ressler, followed by Sonia Boggs. Mr. Ressler? Boggs is next. Doug Furman is after that.
Good afternoon. I'd like to speak about the backlog of over 170 enforcement actions. The BCDC staff has assigned points to the various infractions, determining which are the worst violators. Within the list of violators, there are a large number of public sector agencies, many of which are in the jurisdictions represented on the commission. If you haven't read the minutes of your enforcement workshop, I encourage you to do so because you will learn a lot about your enforcement process. It is interesting to note that we don't seem to hear about any action being taken by BCDC staff against these public agencies. But instead, staff has prioritized lesser violators, often individuals and small businesses, where staff think there are more funds to be gained for the agency by enforcement. As a taxpayer and a friend of Westpoint Harbor, I believe an investigation should be launched as to why BCDC staff prioritizes private individuals while apparently ignoring the public agencies who have higher points for violations represented by the commissioners. And I encourage you today to vote no. Thank you.
Thank you. Doug Furman, followed by Carol Sheets.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Doug Furman. Your Executive Director has written numerous times about how many hours his staff has worked to try and resolve the issues at Westpoint Harbor. His conclusion is that Mark Sanders is an unreasonable man who is unwilling to work with the reasonable BCDC staff. He said that many times. He's never really addressed the issue of his Chief Enforcement Officer, who in an email dated July 22nd, 2010, targeted Mark Sanders at Westpoint Harbor as a big juicy one and ordered that it be your staff's top priority. He also fails to address the notes between Adrian Klein and Brad McCrae dated October 24th, 2012, where they decided they would out-nitpick Mark Sanders. There's nothing in the notes where Brad McCrae said, no, we can't do that. That isn't what BCDC is all about. With the issues in front of you, I would say they have achieved their objectives of creating a big juicy fine and out nitpicking Westpoint Harbor. Mr. Goldsman would have you believe that staff are reasonable and work earnestly to try and resolve the issues, but the facts do not support this statement. You have a problem, and it starts at the top. Today, the Commission gets to decide who is in charge of the future of BCDC, the staff or the Commission. Your decision will determine the new mission statement. BCDC saving the Bay, or BCDC saving the Bay, one brown round table at a time. Thank you.
Carol Sheets, followed by Kevin Parker.
Hello. There are 27 of you up there, I think anyway. And I can't believe that not one of you is thinking there might be something wrong here. I guarantee you that if you owned Westpoint Harbor and any of these permits were presented to you, you wouldn't sign them either. They have errors, they have omissions, they have things in there that are not even in your jurisdiction. If anyone on this staff worked in the private sector, they'd be fired by now. So why are you looking the other way? Are there too many of you? Is one person afraid to say something because no one else is? And you think Mark Sanders is stubborn and hard to work with? Do you think he's fighting this because he's not an environmentalist? Because he doesn't care about the harvest mouse running around on Greco Island? It's quite the contrary. He's fighting this because he's getting screwed over by a government agency that has lost its way and has no oversight. So I ask again, why are you looking the other way? You already got bit in the ass by Sassoon Marsh. Are you going to let it happen again? People are watching. People are paying attention. There are over 5,000 signatures from people who think that what you're doing is wrong. So please stand up. Please say something. Please do the right thing. Because this staff, they're making you look like fools.
Kevin Parker, followed by Arthur Feinstein. Mr. Parker? Going, gone. Arthur, you're up.
What was the name?
Kevin Parker?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. The applause was too loud.
Cute.
Thank you for letting me speak again. I'm very glad to be here again, because I didn't hear you, I couldn't get my notes up. First of all, I want to thank the commissioners for their patience and attention this afternoon and your participation in this process. I, as you can tell from my accent, come from the extreme eastern end of California. I took an exam to be here, and I came here to Northern California because I was told that it was a great northern liberal democracy. And that has been my experience, more or less. The less part we'll get to in a second. I was also told that if I wanted to have a quiet evening out, I should go to a Giants game. Well, it turns out that if I want a quiet afternoon, I should come to a BCDC meeting, because your silence is absolutely deafening. A little while ago, you went into a private session. What could you possibly be discussing that I shouldn't be able to hear? These matters are about things that I care about. Remember, you work for us, and if you don't remember, let me just remind you. California Government Code, section 11120 says about you, the people of the state do not yield their sovereignty to the agencies which serve them. The people in delegating authority do not give public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. So, do tell me, what was so important that only you could know about it in your exalted and esteemed position? It's interesting to me this afternoon that all the speakers have said the same thing. I was delighted that a couple of our friends from the conservation groups got up and said the same thing. We all want Westpoint Harbor to be compliant with the requirements. Nobody yet has proven a single thing that Westpoint has done wrong. There's been no harm to wildlife. There's no proof of that. There's likely harm, maybe, but no proof of it.
Mr. Parker, please conclude.
Okay, let me conclude by this. Can one of you speak about something? And let's have the next meeting at Westpoint.
And our last speaker is Arthur Feinstein. You bat cleanup, sir.
Hi. Well, this has been a sort of brutal session for you all, especially your staff, and I commiserate with them somewhat. When I started going to BCDC hearings, 30, 40 years ago, or let's go before BCDC, when the bay was really being filled, was polluted, before we had our regulatory agencies that were, and we're losing them quickly now under Trump, that were cleaning up our environment, the place was a mess. And it took agencies like you to change it. And there were always people who were unhappy when you did that, because when agencies do their job, there are a lot of unhappy people. But for those of us who appreciate a clean bay, a healthy bay, a bay with wildlife, a bay with fish, a bay we can access, you guys are it. You and your fellow agencies. Without you, we'd be going back to the dark ages. Life would be pretty miserable. My granddaughter would not be enjoying the bay we have now. So, you've heard heartfelt pleas from people. I urge you to ignore them. Because there are many other people who want a clean bay, who understand that regulatory agencies actually know what they're doing. You have had really good staff for the time I've been here. You still do. I urge you to support staff recommendations, move forward, get all these permit requirements fulfilled, which have not been, and continue to do your job, making the bay a place that's livable for us and our wildlife we share the world with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. That concludes the speakers.
There was one more card.
What's the name?
Wilson?
I'm sorry?
Wilson?
I don't have a card, but if somebody wishes to come up and speak, I'll allow it.
Thank you. Just do it quick. First, a housekeeping item. You've noticed I'm a friend of Westpoint Harbor. Bob Wilson, resident of Redwood City. As we've gone through today, you've noticed the Friends of Westpoint Harbor have identified the allegations, and we have pointed to a number of areas of fact, which I know today you're not looking for facts. All of these things are documented either in position papers we've submitted to you or in our overall position paper. So we don't see the facts that support anything. We are all, with respect, believers in the Bay and believers in the environment and believers in your mission. There's no doubt about that amongst our group. If you spend time on the Bay, you care about it. You want to save it. You want to protect it. You want to improve it. Yesterday, there was a letter from a great organization, the Audubon Society, and unfortunately, somehow they've also gotten some bad facts. We've heard a lot about signs. The signs, as were well documented, were posted, more than 30 of them were posted years ago in Westpoint Harbor. It's the responsibility, however, of the Don Edwards Group and their Save the Refuge organization to maintain those signs. Unfortunately, recently, since the November meeting, every one of those signs were removed. We found a few at the bottom of the slough. We've reported it to the police. It's disturbing. The harbor, even though they're not responsible for it, is working with the refuge manager to get the right signs back in place with the right safeguards so that none of the birds are harmed. That's what a responsible community member does. Second and third are related to the mitigation of the shorebird habitat. It's fantastic. I'll take 10 seconds. There were 5 acres in the original bittern pond, surrounded by a chemical called bittern. There's now 30 acres of roosting area, which was agreed to by the BCDC and Cargill and Westpoint Harbor, that's been maintained for over 30 years, for over 16 years. And all of those birds that you're seeing in pictures and videos, that's where they're roosting. That's where they are every day. I'm confused. I just don't understand where the harm has been. We hope you can get to the bottom of this. Please vote no, not de novo. That's a cop-out. Vote no today. There's been enough time.
Yes, vote. Thank you. I would entertain a motion to close the public hearing.
Second.
Vasquez. And Joya seconds. All those in favor of closing the public hearing say yes. Aye. Anybody wish to keep it open? It's unanimous to close the public hearing. Thank you. I'm going to exert the chairman's prerogative to do 2 things. One, there have been a lot of remarks. This is, for better or worse, not the forum to address them publicly. But on the issue of going into closed session, because there are a number of people here who may not be familiar with government process, the respondent's lawyer, as he has every right to do, has demonstrated an indication to take action if we were to support this measure. That's a legitimate threat of litigation, entitled to do it. Nothing wrong with it. When there is a threat of litigation, a public agency like ours is entitled, and indeed some level has responsibility, to discuss that threat in private because it can go to litigation. And if we had some of that discussion in public, it would, 1, destroy the attorney-client privilege with our attorney, and 2, we're entitled to think about our litigation defense privately. That's what happens in those sessions. That's the way it was entitled, and that's what occurred. We took no action in that session. Second, I suspect I'm going to disappoint both counsel. I'm going to use my prerogative to make a motion. And my motion would be, in the context of all that has been presented to us, both in writing and this afternoon, I would move to remand the matter, the entire matter, to the Enforcement Committee to consider any additional information and evidence from staff and from the respondent, and consider any appropriate modifications to the proposed order by staff or by respondent. Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Kate Sears seconds.
And once again, no debate.
Does anybody have any, Commissioner, have any comments or questions on the motion? I have one. I do want to, at some level, echo Mark Zappatello's comment. You obviously have no obligation to engage in further discussion or mediation, but I would urge both sides to think about that, because as many of the speakers and others have said, there in fact are a number of common grounds here. A lot of differences too. Certainly, I think it would be beneficial if there could be a resolution that both sides come to. Given what has happened, I suspect without mediation, that's going to be very difficult. With mediation, it may still be difficult, but possible. It's not part of the motion, it's only a request. With Commissioner Vasquez.
I appreciate you opening that door for both sides to maybe talk or have somebody come in and help mediate the issue before it does apparently go to litigation. If not, we're not sure.
Thank you. Any other comments? We will take a roll call. I'm sorry, Commissioner Pine.
Thank you. I would like to take a few moments and share my observations about the matter. I serve on the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors, so while the Westpoint Marina is not in my supervisorial district, it is in my county. I used to live in Redwood City. I'm very familiar with the Bay Shore. I did have the opportunity to visit Westpoint Marina on 2 occasions, so I would like to just share some observations to both Westpoint and to BCDC. So first off, Westpoint Marina is a remarkable marina. When you see the pictures of the prior bittern pond, this big red blob, and then you look at what it is today, you know, it's a remarkable accomplishment. So we do now have 200 berths, an expanded bay because of the creation of the marina. We do have a shorebird roosting habitat. We have a separate boatyard that was completed in phase 2. And while it's all on hold now, the plan was to have commercial and retail in phase 3. And I also compliment Mr. Sanders because it is clear that he is an extraordinarily environmentally conscious person. The marina has been awarded, has been recognized for being as green as it is. And I think among his other contributions to the environment, a lot of the dredging material from that marina was moved over to Bear Island, which was an incredibly remarkable restoration project. But on the other hand, I do believe there have been instances where, in my opinion, Westpoint has not followed the permit, particularly with respect to the public access. Now, I think most of that public access issues have been resolved as of now. I think it took too long to get there. In addition, I believe, in my opinion, that many actions were taken by Westpoint that were very reasonable, but they didn't comport with the permit, and the permit wasn't amended. So it's kind of a tricky situation there. Turning to BCDC, I'm really proud to serve on this commission, and the job of this commission is to minimize bay fill and provide public access and make sure that bay shore development balances both, can happen while balancing environmental concerns. And the staff here, gives their heart and soul to it, and the success of their work, as pointed out by one of the speakers, is seen in the incredibly improved quality of the bay. On the other hand, I think that BCDC, sometimes the perfect can be the enemy of the good. I think that the original permit conditions themselves don't, in some instances, match the realities on the ground, and it's hard for BCDC to adjust when that occurs, in my opinion. So now what are we going to do? We could continue to fight this, and that would be a poor path, The cost will be enormous in terms of private legal fees and public payment for attorneys. And also, I think everyone has to keep in mind that there's really, I can't imagine a scenario where BCDC and Westpoint can part ways. I mean, as someone has said, it's, we're married and there's like no option for divorce. So, we can fight and fight and fight, but we have to, we have to remain partners in the future. So my hope, my sincere hope, is that the parties can pull back from this brink. And I think actually the foundation is really there for resolution. First off, Amendment number 5, which the parties worked on extraordinarily hard for a long time. If it were to be signed, it would clear up a number of these violations. And then secondly, many of the remaining violations, I think, can be resolved either by modest actions by Westpoint or by amending the permit to allow the conditions to remain. So I don't know if it's possible, but I think the idea of a mediator, a mutually acceptable mediator between BCDC and Westpoint, perhaps could build off this foundation and we get this back on track. Our values are the same. Westpoint Marina is an incredible place. BCDC's, its mission is one that none of us dispute. And if you step away from it all, this should be resolvable. And I hope that it is.
Thank you, sir. Sharon, will you?
Mr. Chairman, may I address briefly?
No, sir, I'm sorry, you actually can't. The problem with your comment is it's going to open comments up. We have closed the public hearing.
I'll just simply note our objection as respondents to what you're proposing to take a vote on. I just note that for the record.
So noted. Thank you. Sharon, will you, should I take a roll call vote? The federal representative may vote on this.
Commissioner Adiego?
Yes.
Commissioner Gilmore? Yes. Commissioner Sheriff?
Yes.
Commissioner Gibbs?
Yes.
Commissioner Joya?
Yes.
Commissioner McGrath?
Yes.
Commissioner Peskin?
Aye.
Commissioner Pine?
Aye.
Commissioner Chad?
Yes.
Commissioner Sears?
Yes.
Commissioner Tekel? Aye. Commissioner Ragan-Canet?
Yes.
Commissioner Chappelle?
Yes.
Chair Wasserman?
Yes.
And Commissioner Randolph here too.
Commissioner Randolph, yes.
Okay, sorry.
Miss me too.
Yes, she has it. I have it, okay. Commissioner Randolph? Commissioner Ziegler?
Yes.
Whistler. And Vasquez.
Whistler and Vasquez.
Okay, sorry. Commissioner Vasquez?
Yes.
And Commissioner Whistler?
Aye.
Anybody else miss?
6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12,
The
13,
ayes
14.
have it. The motion passes unanimously. Sorry. The ayes have it. The motion passes unanimously. I thank all of you for your attention and your patience.
Mr. Chairman, would you mind repeating the motion?
Motion was to amend.
The motion was submitted and it will be available for you. The fundamental motion is that it was remanded to the Enforcement Committee. I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Peskin and Gilmore. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed stay. The commission is adjourned.